are one of those things, I don't mind snakes too much as long as I know they're there, right? But if I get startled by a snake, if I get surprised by a snake, that's a different story, right? There's one time that my dad and I were hiking, we were backpacking in the Smoky Mountains. And we're walking along, and my dad is going, and he's in front of me, and he goes and a few feet ahead of me, and he walks right past this rattlesnake. It's sunning itself, about 6 foot long, big, long, timber rattlesnake, sunning itself right on the trail. And there's nothing but blackberry bushes on either side of the trail, and so there's no way to get around it. And I see it right before I pass it, and I freak out and I jump backwards. And now we're sitting there with the snake in between us. He's on that side, I'm on this side. People are coming down the trail. They're all, like this one snake had about 30 of us all stopped on the trail because it surprised us and startled us. Y'all like surprises? Some? Those kind of surprises, not at all, right? Yeah, I don't like those kinds of surprises either. But there are other surprises that are really good. Like when we get a birthday surprise party, somebody throws us a surprise party, or somebody gets us a gift. That's a really good surprise. Or like when we're walking along, my granddad used to walk the same route every single day, and he'd walk through all of the drive-thrus. And along this little route that went by the grocery store and went by Wendy's and McDonald's, he'd go and check all the phone booths. Y'all don't know what phone booths are, but he'd check all the phone booths for change. He'd walk through all the drive-thrus for change. And there was one time he found a $100 bill sitting in one of the drive-thrus. And so that was a pretty good surprise that he had. Surprises can be a lot of fun. But sometimes surprises can also be kind of scary. But last week, during the children's moment, I told the kids that in Easter, we celebrate the biggest surprise the world has ever known. Right? The resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus is the biggest surprise ever. And this one surprise of Jesus overcoming sin and death changed the world. But God's surprises didn't end there. God's surprises didn't end just with that one event. That was the big surprise. That was the biggest surprise. But over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at the book of Acts as the disciples and the apostles are going out and telling everybody about Jesus and about the resurrection and we're going to be looking at the ways that God continues to surprise them as they're telling others about Jesus. But the story this week isn't so much God isn't the one who's full of surprises. In the story this week, God isn't the one who's full of surprises. Peter is the one who's full of surprises for us this week. You see, Peter was this guy, one of the disciples, one of the ones that had been following Jesus. And Peter is this guy who had been, when Jesus said, hey, you've been fishing all night, you haven't caught anything, cast your net over on the other side. And Peter's like, yeah, right. And he didn't believe that it would happen, but he went ahead and did it anyway, right? He was the one who wanted to send everybody home because he didn't think that just a little bit of bread and fish would be enough to feed all these people. Peter was the one who tried to walk on water. But as soon as the waves came up, he got scared and started to sink. Peter was the guy who denied Jesus and ran away in fear. So Peter was this guy that throughout of the Gospels we see all the time these stories of Peter doubting and worrying and denying and not really being sure if he could trust Jesus. And then in the end, he runs away, he denies Jesus, and he hides out with the other disciples, afraid that the people that killed Jesus were going to come and kill them too. But can we blame them? Can we blame Peter really for being afraid? Can we really blame Peter for being afraid? I don't know that we can. I don't know that we can. The reality is that there are some people in the world right now, Christians in the world right now, that live in fear of their lives. There are some Christians, there are some missionaries right now that go to certain parts of the world, and because that part of the world, you can't be Christian, you can't be a missionary, you can't be anything, they have to pretend to be a doctor or a nurse, or they'll go as a doctor or nurse. But their real reason for being there is to tell people about Jesus. And they have to keep that secret because their life depends on it. There are some Christians in the world who got up this morning and to go to church, and they had to worry about who might be following them. They had to worry about what might happen to them if they get caught. There were some Christians last week in Sri Lanka who lost their lives, who lost their family members because of a terrorist attack. And so there are people in the world who really and truly face persecution in their lives just for following Jesus. But the reality is, in our lives, we don't really face that kind of persecution, but we're still afraid. No, aren't we sometimes? We don't face that kind of persecution, but we're still afraid to tell people about Jesus. We're still afraid to stand up take a stand for Christ. We're afraid that folks won't want to be around us, right? Or that they'll look at us sideways every time they see us because they think we get too preachy. We're afraid that if we reach out to someone and tell them about Jesus, that we might have to invest too much of our time and our energy into their lives. We're afraid that if we start helping them, that we won't be able to stop. We're afraid that if we're afraid to put our friendships and ourselves and our jobs on the line to stand up for someone who's being harmed by the words and the actions of others. We're afraid sometimes that the Holy Spirit might take over and we won't be able to control it. So we, a lot of times, have fear when it comes to following Jesus. When it comes to telling others about Jesus and living and being a witness for Jesus. We live in this fear. So we can't really blame Peter and the disciples too much for the fear that they had. But here's the crazy thing about this story. Is that when we see this story, when we see what we read today, that was only partway through the story. If you look at the whole thing, what you find is that that Peter was out and teaching and yelling and proclaiming and preaching about Jesus every day. In the city square, in the temple courts, every chance he got, he was telling people about Jesus. He got brought in by the high council and they said, look, you need to stop talking about Jesus. And they sent him off. And he didn't stop. He kept doing it. He kept telling more and more people. They continued to pick up the work where Jesus left off, healing people and feeding people and caring for people. And more disciples were being made. More and more people were beginning to believe in this risen Jesus. And it was really making the leaders upset. It was really making the leaders upset because it threatened their control. It threatened their power. And so they arrested him again. This time they arrested him, they threw him in jail. And that night, an angel broke him out. And broke him out of jail. And the first thing Peter and the apostles do, they go right back to the temple court and start preaching again. They weren't going to shut up. You ever have that thing? You ever have that surprise or something where you've got a secret or you've got a surprise and you just almost can't control it? Like it's everything you can do not to spill the beans. On the outside, you might be cool as a cucumber, but on the inside, you might be kind of like the person in this skit from Saturday Night Live.
Okay, you guys, can I have your attention? First, just so I don't have to tell you all individually, because I know you're all going to ask. Yes, everything in this house is from Pure One. Okay, everything. Second, and this is slightly more important, my brother Paul got special holiday leave from the military, and he's going to be here tonight for Thanksgiving dinner. Oh, yeah, well, it gets better. We didn't tell Mom. She has no idea. We're going to surprise her. Oh. She is going to be shocked.
Yeah, I can't wait to see your face.
My God.
This was a great idea. What do you need us to do?
Well, we have the whole thing planned out. My God. It's a surprise. And there's a plan. She doesn't know it.
Sue, are you all right?
Oh, God. I just love surprises. So freaking effing excited. Okay. So Paul's waiting right now at our neighbor's house. As soon as Mom is here, I'll text him to come in and surprise her. Sue? Just see? She's gonna get here? Thinking her son is overseas? But he's over there? Opening the door? And she's surprised?
Oh, I have an idea. Should I go with my phone?
Yes! Okay, well, anyway, I thought after Mom gets here, we'll start eating. And then Paul. Oh, God, we're not eating! Corbin, tell me, is it better?
Sue, everyone's excited, but we have to keep it together.
Yeah, when Mom gets here, we can't act like anything out of the ordinary is happening. Everybody just has to act natural. Can you do that, Sue?
Natural, yes, yes. I'll just look at my hand. Oh, no! My legs are locking up. Don't grab! Well, Mom's gonna be here any minute. How about when she sees Paul, everyone just yells surprise. Oh my God! I forgot about the yelling. It's from Pure One.
That's Sue. It's Sue, you're ruining the surprise.
So freaking freaked. Okay, I think I know what's gonna make me feel better. Let me just do a practice surprise. Put it in the dry run. Okay, fine. I'll be Mom, right? Very all acting natural, right? The doorbell rings. She opens the door. Paul's there, and we all yell. Surprise!
So sometimes when we have a surprise, when we have something that we're hanging on to, or that we are excited about and we're excited to tell others about, we're kind of like that there's nothing and nobody that's ever going to stop us from saying that. And that's the way that Peter and the apostles got. That's the way that they became. There was nobody and nothing that was going to stop them from telling others about Jesus. So what changed? What changed? What happened between the time where Peter was hiding out and the apostles were hiding out in fear and this point here where they were so excited to tell others about Jesus that they were so bold to tell, that they were so unafraid that even at the end of the story, when they get beaten for telling people about Jesus, because that's what they finally decided to do, they said, okay, well, we're going to give them a good beating this time, and then we'll tell them not to do it again. And they run out rejoicing, singing, excited that they were worthy of suffering for Jesus. What happened between those two places? Well, I think that one of the things that happened is that he was surprised by God. He was surprised by God. That Peter and these apostles, they were surprised by God. That this big surprise of Jesus being resurrected was just the last of a series of surprises that God had brought into their life. That every time that Peter put his trust in Jesus, and even though it looked like it was impossible. It looked like that this thing couldn't happen. He put his trust in Jesus, and he was surprised by the results. So Jesus said, put your net in the other side. He goes, okay, sure, whatever. And then he gets more fish than he could count. He sits there and says, Jesus says, no, we're going to go ahead and feed these folks. Don't send them home. He's like, okay, sure, whatever. And they have more food than they know what to do with. Jesus says, walk on the water. Go ahead and come out here. He starts to sink. Jesus grabs his hand and they walk back together. And he's surprised every time. And this resurrection was just one more surprise that God had brought into his life. That God had surprised him over and over again with the impossible, with the miraculously unexpected. That Peter had been surprised by God so much that he's learned that he can always bet on God to surprise him. He's been surprised by God so much that no matter how grim the circumstances, he knows that God has something up his sleeve. He's been surprised by God so much that he has learned to bank on it, to count on it, to count on the fact that God is going to show up, is going to do something, is going to redeem that situation, whatever it is, whatever it looks like. Adam Hamilton talks about the resurrection, and he tells the story about somebody coming up to him and saying, do you really believe that? Do you really believe all that you say about the resurrection, about Jesus being alive? And Adam Hamilton's response is, I not only believe it, I'm counting on it. I'm banking on it. I'm putting all of my chips in that. I said last week that, and I'll say it again, that a lot of times we don't see God in the windshield. A lot of times we don't see God in front of us, but we always see God in the rearview mirror. When we're going through life and we're facing struggles and challenges that we can't seem to overcome, circumstances that make us afraid or anxious about the future, I may not always see how God is at work in that situation. I look at the situation in my life, and I may be struggling with my finances. I may be having issues with the relationship, and I may not see where God is at work in that situation. But what I can do is I can look back. I look back over my life and I look at all the times that God has surprised me, where God has made a way out of no way, where God has shown up and been and stood in the gap between what I had and what I didn't and what I needed. And I can see all the different places where God has been working in my life, and I can trust. I can count on it. I can bank it. I can put my hope in the fact that God is also working in this, whatever it is. I know that no matter what I'm facing, I can do it with boldness. I can do it with an understanding and a knowledge and a hope that it will work out, and I can do it with an understanding that God is at work in it, because I can look back and see all the places where God has surprised me in the past. And it doesn't mean that we just sit back and we wait for God to show up. It doesn't mean that we just sit back and hope and pray that it goes away. But what it does mean, it doesn't mean that we're going to get the answer that we want. That's the hardest part to accept. A lot of times we get the answer we need, and not the answer that we want. But what we do know is we do know that prayer works. We do know that God will show up. We do know that God is at work in our lives and in our witness. We know that through prayer, God leads us to act on His unseen potential for surprise. And so we don't have to, and so when we're faced with those situations, like we were talking about earlier with what decision do we make? Do we do the right thing, or we do the thing that we're being told to do? Do we obey God, or do we obey the people around us or above us? We know that God is going to lead us to act on His unseen potential for surprise, rather than obey the expectations of this world. One of the recurring themes in all of Scripture and all of history is that no matter what you're doing, if God is doing a new thing, that there are going to be some people who are against it. Right? Every time God's doing a new thing, and what we see in this passage is God's doing a new thing, and the people who are in charge are threatened by that, because God has a tendency to always do the new thing over here on the margins, over here on the side, and the people that are in the middle a lot of times feel threatened by it. The ones who are in charge. Whenever God is doing a new thing, it's going to look strange, it's going to look different. Whenever God is doing a new thing, there are going to be people who are against it. If God's doing a new thing in the church, then there are going to be some people who want to oppose it. If God's doing a new thing in our community, there are going to be some people who resist it. If God's doing a new thing in your life, there are going to be some people and some forces that are going to tell you that that new thing isn't real. It's going to oppose what God's doing in your life. But in the gospel, with this good news of the resurrection, we don't have to fear those forces. We don't have to fear those people. We don't have to fear death itself. We have no fear. We can rejoice that we have the opportunity to suffer for Christ. We can stand boldly in the face of whatever it is that opposes us. We can even stand without an idea of vengeance or an idea of retaliation. We can stand simply in the mercy and the forgiveness and the grace of Christ. Knowing that the resurrection is greater than our death. Knowing that God's forgiveness is greater than our sin and brokenness. Knowing that the good news of the boundless love of Christ leads our self-protection into self-sacrifice. So may you be surprised by God. May you be surprised by hope. And may your life be a witness to the good news of Jesus Christ. Let's pray. God, we thank you that you constantly surprise us with your love. You constantly surprise us with your presence. And we pray, God, that you will help us to live into the resurrection, that you will help us to be witnesses of your life, your living presence. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.